Hello, I'm Tracy Nicholas, and welcome to Folkloring. I am a passionate folklore practitioner, and to me, folkloring is more than just a podcast. It's my commitment to help you connect with your roots and awaken the wisdom within you.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Folkloring, which is going to be all about the folklore of bread. But before I get into any of that, I wanted to tell you how I've been folkloring lately. Now, not too long ago, I had been given a small pendant by my boyfriend, and I wear it all the time because it reminds me of him. And I was talking to a woman, and I was telling her that I have a lot of trouble grounding. I always have. I'm just not very good at it. And she said, you need to find yourself a little talisman that you can have on you for when you need to ground yourself. And you grab that talisman, practice with it when you're in a place where it's calm and a controlled environment, and just keep practicing with it. So if you are out and about somewhere and you feel like the energy is really chaotic and you need to ground yourself, you can grab that talisman. And so I've decided to use this pendant that my boyfriend gave me for that exact purpose. And so I've been doing that lately with just sort of practicing it. I haven't tried it out in the wild yet. I haven't needed to, but I will let you know if this technique works. Now, the other thing that I've done lately, you guys, I messed up. I messed up bad. I am a neglectful sourdough parent at best, and I got really bad, and so of course I had forgotten about it in the fridge, and I ended up making some hooch, which is, a byproduct for when you haven't fed the sourdough in too long and it starts to starve, basically. Now, typically this is pretty standard. It happens a lot, and it's not that hard to fix. You just need to really feed the starter again and be really careful about it for a little bit. And I have been feeding this starter, and every time I go to open it up to give it a whiff to see if it smells like alcohol, because that's what it will smell like, it's always just as bad. I feel like if you could get a contact buzz off of alcohol, I would be. So I'm going to continue to try and save the starter, and hopefully that will work out. And of course, that was a very appropriate kind of folkloring for this episode, as we are going to talk all about bread. And I do have a tendency to pick very, very large topics, which I have once again done. There's so much lore about bread from all over the world, which is not really surprising because bread has been a staple food for people for a very, very long time all over the world. And also, there's really an endless variety of breads. It can be different shapes, depending on what ingredients you include, whether or not it's a type of bread that rises, the kinds of patterns that you will carve on top of the bread. It just is so endless with all of the different ways that we eat bread. And of course, we refer to our livelihood. There's a saying called it's our bread and butter. And so it's definitely very important to us. Now, there's a couple of other things that different words for bread might mean. If you look at the French word miche, it's used for a round bread loaf, but it also is a euphemism for breasts or buttocks. And in English, buns refers to buttocks as well. And in Italy, around the region of Naples, a small bread loaf is known as an angel's penis. So I'm sure they're delicious. In Germany, the word Brotlieb can refer to the female body as well. So a couple of fun euphemisms out there to just get us started. Now, as I said, this is a huge topic, so I'm going to try and make this not sound like a big long list, but I do want to go through some superstitions first because they're fascinating. Now, in Cajun, for good fortune, you never eat both ends of a loaf of bread before you've eaten the middle, because if you do, you'll have trouble making ends meet. In Ireland, they believe that fairies don't like bread. And in Yorkshire, it was believed that if a loaf of bread failed to rise, it meant there was an undiscovered corpse nearby. So I guess in that case, that would be the dead not rising. In January, on St. Agnes's Eve, it's believed that if you drink parsley tea and eat stale bread before going to sleep, it would bring you dreams about the person you were destined to marry. And eating stale bread before bed seems like it would keep me up, but maybe that's just me. Now, you're supposed to bring salt and bread into the house first before moving in, because salt represents wealth and bread represents food, so you'll never lack wealth or go hungry. And also people give newlyweds bread and salt to express hope for health and prosperity in the future. And in Russia, a salt cellar is placed on top of a loaf of bread, which is then presented to the couple by one of their mothers. You're not supposed to bake any loaves of bread on Samhain in case you bring the ghosts to you because they're hungry and want to eat it. And in parts of Appalachia, it's important to watch when you slice a loaf of bread for the first time, because if you slice through a hole in the bread, it means someone is going to die, and that is sometimes referred to as the coffin, that hole. And if you put a slice of bread into a cradle, it will protect the infant from disease, also in Appalachia. Now, we talked about bread and butter, and for many cultures, the breaking of bread is symbolic of peace and hospitality, because the idea is, once you've welcomed someone into your home, you've eaten bread together, you're somewhat less likely to kill each other. So, in parts of Norway, boys and girls who share bread from the same loaf are destined to fall in love and marry. And in Scotland, there's a tradition known as first footing, which we did talk about in our New Year's episode. And it's the first person to cross a home's threshold brings the residents good luck for the coming year. And so while you're waiting for that first guest to arrive, you're to place a slice of bread and a silver coin outside the door for prosperity and warmth. And who knows, maybe it's welcoming for that first visitor. Now, if you're baking bread and the yeast fails to rise, then it was once believed that you had been cursed by a witch. But you can manage this by marking the bread with a cross on top. And there's also belief if it doesn't rise, the devil is sitting on the bread, again, fixed with a cross, which is, kind of funny because obviously it does, if you, are scoring the top of the bread, then it helps it to rise more evenly when it's, baking. And so, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later. We're going to get into some specific kinds of bread, and cross buns are one of those kinds of bread. Now, in Sweden, it's customary to prepare a flat, round bread and pierce it with a hole when a daughter is first born, and then the bread is eaten the day she gets married. Now, I have no idea how they keep it edible for all that time, but that is the custom. And in Hamburg, Germany, a very suggestive triphallic bread is offered to a bride and groom on their wedding day. And I have never used the word triphallic before, so it's a great day. Now, throwing bread out or placing it upside down on the table is supposed to bring bad luck. And this is connected to an older belief that bread turned toward the entrails of the earth was thereby turned toward hell, and it might attract evil spirits. Now, Speaking of spirits, there was once a practice called sin eating. And what this was, when a person died, the mourners would pass bread over the body of the deceased. And sometimes they would even place it right on the corpse's chest. And that was believed that the bread would absorb the sins of the deceased. And then they would find someone who would do this for a living, and it was usually a very poor person. They would eat the bread, and by doing so, the sin eater took on the deceased person's sins. So, now I also did find there is a bread museum called the Lulis Museum in Greece. And so I found some really interesting practices from Greece. Now there, it was believed that you never loaned out a full loaf of bread or gave out a full loaf of bread so that the abundance of your house wouldn't be transferred with the loaf to someone else. And you should always cut and retain a small piece from the bread to bind the fate of the house. And the girls, Greek girls, never left a mouthful unfinished because they would lose their fortune, and there was a risk then that they would remain unmarried. And boys had to eat every last morsel because if someone else ate it, they would lose their strength to the person that ate it. And they even had an oath that was taken by farmers, and it was called by the bread. And it is because people respected bread so much, and they knew how important it was to them and to their ongoing success and being able to sustain themselves. So that was a very powerful oath that they would take. Now, in ancient Rome, again, the families of newlyweds, they would eat bread together during the ceremony to tie the families together. And in ancient Macedonia, during the wedding ceremony, they would cut freshly baked bread in half and give one piece to the newlywed as a blessing for the ceremony, and the rest was used as an offering. Now, the Hittites, which were an ancient people that lived in the area that is now modern-day Turkey, they would serve bread to soldiers to preserve them from impotence, and that leavened bread would help ward off epidemics, provided that it was previously placed in a special barrel used to be sure that this bread would have those qualities. Now, in Belgium, during the Middle Ages, bread kneaded on Christmas Eve protect the home against lightning. And in another medieval belief, bakers refused to have any physical contact with or even serve the executioner of Paris. And because he was a man who, inspired fear and was not well liked by the people of the city. And ultimately, the king was forced to issue an edict that compelled the bakers to serve the executioner. And in protest, and as a sign of their dissatisfaction with having to do it, the bakers turned the executioner's loaf upside down on the rack to distinguish it from the others and apparently give him some bad luck. Now, speaking of bad luck, there was a practice in ancient times. It was a divination practice called cursed bread. And a small piece of bread over which a spell had been cast was administered to someone who was suspected of being a witch. And if it caused sickness or choking, the person was said to be guilty. And if not, he or she was regarded as innocent. And interestingly, barley bread was often used for this form of divination since it was more likely to cause choking because it was crumbly. And this was practiced among the Anglo-Saxons. Now, religions have a lot of different uses for bread in different ceremonies. In the Jewish religion, during the celebration of the Sabbath, the holy day of the week, one of the dominant elements on the table is the challah, which is the blessed bread. And in Hebrew, Bethlehem means house of bread. Now, This city is located 7 kilometers south of Jerusalem and considered the birthplace of Jesus. In the Old Testament, the Eternal sends manna to the Hebrews when they're crossing the desert, and that manna symbolizes bread, and it comes way before the idea of the Christian Eucharist, and it's a sign of generosity of God toward humankind. Now, one of the names for the celebration of Passover is the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, basically. And the Jewish matzah that they eat during Passover is an unleavened bread that is eaten to commemorate this, because they didn't have time to let their bread rise before they had to leave quickly. And of course, in the Catholic Church, unleavened bread is used in some cases, but not all, to prepare the hosts for the Eucharist. In the Orthodox Church, they do use leavened bread. In Christianity, there are lots of references to bread in both the Old and the New Testament. There's manna from heaven that God sent to Moses. There's the miracle with the 5 loaves in the wilderness, and many more. However, I'm just going to focus on the one where bread was given by Jesus when he likened himself to the bread, and he said to his disciples, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not be hungry." And Jesus, blessed the bread during the Last Supper, and he cut it to pieces and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And then, of course, he blessed the wine and said, "Drink from this, it is my blood." And that's how they established the sacrament of the Holy Communion, which was, it's one of the most significant sacraments in the Christian faith. Now, as I said earlier, in Orthodox, to prepare the divine Eucharist, they use something called prosphero, and it's a votive loaf of bread. But in the Roman Catholic Church, they use something called ostia, and that's those very small round wafers that I think most of us are familiar with. And those are what is used in the Holy Communion. In ancient Rome, they worshipped a deity called Jupiter Pistor, or Jupiter the Baker. And according to the poet Ovid, when the Gauls attacked Rome in 387 BCE, the Romans invoked Jupiter, and the god came and counseled them to throw what was most precious to them over the walls. And while they were still praying, they prepared small loaves of bread with their final remaining flour, and they threw the loaves over the wall as the god had told them to do. And when they saw this, the Gauls believed that Rome was so well provisioned that it had the wherewithal to withstand a really lengthy siege. And so they abandoned the assault of the city. And in recognition of the god's great counsel, they built a temple to Jupiter Pistor that associates with the symbol of wheat and life and death and rebirth with the destiny of the city. There are also various additional powers attributed to bread that's been blessed by a priest. Now, in Italy, at the end of the feast in honor of Saint Joseph, the guests are sent home with a piece of consecrated bread to keep in the house to bring fertility and good fortune in the coming year. And on the feast of Saint Colligero, the Sicilians bring bread covered with poppy seed to a church to be blessed. And sailors will keep this consecrated bread to throw upon stormy weathers for a safe return of the fishermen out at sea in a storm. Now, Russia has an Easter bread called kulik, and it is a sort of domed cylindrical loaf, and it's decorated with Easter symbols. And they surround it with dyed eggs. It's topped with a beeswax candle, and they take that to the church to be blessed. And according to the belief, the sign of a perfectly baked kulich is that it will never mold. And some say it'll last for a year, but it is shared with the departed when on Easter Monday, families go to the cemetery to picnic at the gravesides. Now, some of you may have heard of St. Anthony's bread, which is associated with a Franciscan-run charity program. And it is, we'll give out staple foods like bread. And there's a legend behind this, and one legend dates back to the year 1265, when it's said that a child was drowned near the Paduan Basilica of St. Anthony while it was being constructed. Now, the child's mother prayed to the saint to bring her boy back to life, and in return, she promised to give to the poor an amount of corn equal to the child's weight. And the child was miraculously revived, and the mother made good on her promise. Now, fast forward a few centuries to 1888, and there was a woman named Louise Bouffier, and she managed a small bakery store in the seaside village of Toulon, France. And one morning, she couldn't open the shop's door with her key. So she calls a locksmith, and he couldn't get it open either and said he'd have to break the door open. And he went to go get his tools to do so. And so Louise prayed to St. Anthony that she would give some of her bakery's bread to the poor if the door could be opened without breaking it down. And when the locksmith came back with his tools, he tried the lock one more time just to be sure, and he immediately was easily able to open the door. And so, true to her word, she made sure that the poor of Toulon received this bread that she promised. And then it wasn't very long after that before her friends began to follow her example of promising a gift of bread or alms to the poor in return for prayers answered by St. Anthony. And in the 1890s, they formalized this practice by founding the charity called St. Anthony's Bread. Now I'm going to talk about a couple of specific types of bread and what the lore is around them. And the first one I'm going to talk about is called cockle bread. And in the UK, they made this particular bread in a very strange way. Now, cockle bread was used by young women as a way to win over a lover. And while they made this bread, they would chant the following rhyme: "My granny is sick and now is dead, and we'll go mold some cockle bread. Up with my heels, down with my head, and this is the way to mold cockle bread." Now, when they were kneading the dough, here's where the odd part comes in. In order to ensure that this bread would bring their love to them, they would knead the bread with the girl's buttocks. And then if they would feed this morsel of bread to the boy she desired, he would fall in love with her. I did see one recounting where basically the girl gets up on the table and she kind of makes a kneading motion with her butt. So I guess that was the original twerking. But then there were other accounts that sounded like there really was some of that dough actually touching the girl's buttocks. Now, I could not find any kind of proof of whether or not that bottom was bare or had something covering it. So I suppose that was a particularly spicy kind of bread. Now, the next bread I want to talk about is shortbread. And I'm not going to be talking about shortbread cookies, which when I think of shortbread now, that's what I think of as shortbread cookies. But big, elaborate wedding cakes have not always been at the center of a wedding feast. In Scotland, in the past, the most important food of the day was called the infar cake. And it was a decorated piece of shortbread. And shortbread, so basically, short historically means something that's baked with a lot of fat, and it makes it crumbly as opposed to less fat that wouldn't make as many, little bits and crumbs. And as for bread, originally in Scotland, people made shortbread from leftover bread dough that they added more fat to, and then it would crumble apart. And the wedding shortbread was traditionally baked by the mother of the bride, and then after they got married, they would hold the bread over the heads of the new couple, and they'd break the bread. And as the pieces fell around them, they would find the number of fragments that had fallen. And the more bits that it had broken into, the more children the couple were destined to have. Now, sometimes pieces of this shortbread were tossed over the heads of the bride and groom as they were entering their new home. Now, that might seem to be a waste of food, but the bits that were left on the floor could still be used. The guests would scramble to gather up all of these crumbs, especially the guests who were unmarried. And then these were then carried back to their homes and placed under their pillow in hopes that they would provoke a dream of who their future love was going to be. Now, next, I want to talk about hot cross buns. And there's lots of lore around this. I'm not going to talk about all of it because it's just so much. Hot cross buns are used in Britain at Easter. They're made at Easter. And they're often stuffed with dried fruits, made with spices, and they're marked with a cross on the top. Now, if you bake yours on Good Friday, again, the bread will not spoil or grow mold. And there are examples of ancient hot cross buns, which suggests that they do last a long time. And there are even pubs in London where they hang up hot cross buns and they, still look remarkably good. They hang them up year after year. I suppose what they really do is dry completely out. Now, historically, preserved hot cross buns were grated into food and they would be used as a cure-all for lots of different ailments. They were also used, they would hang them in houses in order to prevent house fires, and would hang them also in barns to prevent evil spirits from attacking the livestock. Also, sailors would want them on their ship so they wouldn't sink. And the cross, again, we talked earlier about carving a cross so either a witch doesn't sit on the bun or the devil doesn't sit on the bun and prevent it from rising. Now, the last type of bread that I want to talk about is Irish soda bread. And soda bread's very interesting because the bread's shape reflects the region that it's come from. So in Northern Ireland, people prefer the style of farl, while in Southern Ireland, they prefer something called cake. And farl, which translates to four-part, is normally rolled out into a circle, cut into 4 pieces, and baked in a frying pan rather than in an oven. Irish soda cake, on the other hand, is the version, if you're in the States, you'll see that version most often. And it is used to describe soda bread that has been kneaded into a flat, round shape and baked in the oven. Now, again, here, cutting a cross on top of your soda bread is going to keep the devil away. And in the 19th century, it was believed that a cross slashed across the top of your bread would let the devil out if he was in there while the bread was being baked. And it's, obviously believed that the symbolism can be interpreted as blessing the bread, as God blessing the bread. But as I said earlier, the openings in the bread allow the bread to rise without it splitting. And so that's one of the reasons why we do it, even though we can make such pretty designs with it. So I couldn't really talk about bread without at least a mention of sandwiches. And The man who is often given credit for inventing sandwiches was an Englishman named John Montagu, and he was the fourth Earl of Sandwich. He was supposed to be an infamous debaucher and a rake and a gambler, and it's interesting, though, because he did not invent sandwiches. People were eating sandwiches for centuries before the Earl did. They just called them something different. He did popularize them in polite society, though, and his name was attached to them in the 1760s. But before that, they were sort of unimaginatively, I suppose, called bread and meat or bread and cheese. But then his name got tied to it, and the story goes he was in London in 1762, and he was at a card table gambling, and he grew hungry, but he didn't want to leave the table and go get something to eat. And so the Earl called for food, and he put some beef in between a couple of slices of bread so that the food wouldn't, stain the cards, or he wouldn't get his hands messy and touch the cards. And they think that it's also just as probable that he was sort of working on government business at his desk, and that he asked for food to be brought to him there. And, he made his sandwich there. And when the Earl would go out in London society, he would ask waiters and chefs for bread and meat because he liked this snack. And so he started getting it a lot, and he started making these sandwiches. And so his friends started ordering the same as sandwich. And that kind of tied his name to what we now know as sandwiches. Interestingly, in the Middle Ages, the rich people would use wooden and metal plates, but the poorer people used something called trenchers. And these were thick slices of very, very often stale bread beneath their meat and cheese, and if they had vegetables. And they would use that as a plate. And, it's sort of like an open sandwich, because at the end they would then either eat the plate or throw it to their dog to finish up. So there was no washing up then, I suppose. Now, before I get to the folkloring part of this episode, I did want to finish up with a fairy tale called The Baker's Daughter. So once there was a baker and his daughter who helped him in his bakery, and they were well known to be greedy and dishonest. And one day, an old woman comes into the shop and begs for some dough to make bread. And the daughter doesn't want to give her the dough, but she feels compelled to do so. And so she gives her just a very tiny little bit of bread. And the old woman asks, "Can I use your oven to bake this bread?" And she lets the old woman do so. And when the bread was done and they opened it up, it was a big loaf. It was bigger than any of the other loaves that were in the oven. And so the daughter didn't want to give away this huge loaf of bread. She told the woman, no, this is not a good loaf for you. We're going to bake you a different loaf. And so she got some dough, and it was about half of what it had previously been that she had given the old woman. And so they put this bread in the oven and bake it. And when they opened the oven up, it was twice the size as the large loaf of bread that the old woman had baked previously. And so now the daughter really wasn't going to give up that loaf. And so she took a tiny little bit of dough, no bigger than a thumbnail, and she gave that to the old woman to bake. And that got put into the oven and baked. And when they opened the oven, lo and behold, it was even bigger than the last loaf. So the girl turns to the old woman and goes, who? But before she could ask, "Who are you?" the old woman revealed herself to be a fairy and said, "Now all you'll ever say is who. and she turned her into an owl for her greed. Now, I'm not sure how this ties in with the earlier belief that fairies don't like bread, but there you have it. So, a little bit of folkloring. Some of this should be really obvious. You can bake bread, and there's a million recipes out there for that. But if you don't want to bake your bread, as they say, store-bought is fine. And you can use bread for offerings. You can think about the symbolism of the bread when you're eating bread. You can experiment if you don't want to go through the process of, the rising of the bread. You can experiment. There's as many kinds of flatbreads as we have, possible ingredients to make them with. You might want to consider donating some bread to a food bank. I think that a lot of people that donate to food banks are donating canned goods and like dried pastas and things like that they know are shelf stable. And so having some fresh bread can really be a treat for someone who is relying on the food bank for their food. If you're particularly ambitious, you could consider experimenting with some local native foods that maybe you've foraged. I know that in my area, acorns with the proper treatment and soaking, they can be ground down to a flour that is supposedly excellent for anything you would use flour for. And also in my area, I didn't know this when I was growing up, but the tops of pussy willows, which we called either cattails or catkins, but that sort of brown area that's fuzzy at the top, that's thicker than the main stem, those can also be ground down with the right treatment, with the right processing, and flour can be made out of those as well, and that's supposed to make really good bread. So if you are feeling ambitious, that is definitely a possibility for you. As always, when foraging, make sure you are 100% certain that you have the edible variety of what you're foraging and not some look-alike. So that is everything I have for today's episode, and I hope that you enjoyed it. If you have any other thoughts about bread or any other ideas about how to go about folkloring in regards to bread, I would love to hear it. And thank you for taking the time to listen today.
As always, thanks for listening to Folkloring. If you liked what you heard, please consider leaving a rating and review, and don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions or comments or would like to suggest a topic for a future episode, please email us at folkloringpod@gmail.com or message us on Facebook or Instagram. Other places you can find me are at the Folklore Podcast as the theater, film, and storytellers correspondent, or creating folklore-inspired games at madmenandheroes.com. Stay curious, stay connected, and keep the traditions alive. And I hope that wherever you are, folklore is making your life more magical.